I was born on Metallica Prime in Hab Block 17 Gamma, subsection 412. I know this because the designation was tattooed beneath my left ear 3 hours after my birth. My mother held me for 147 minutes before the Mechanicus collectors came. I have accessed this memory so many times that I cannot determine if I actually remember her warmth, or if I have simply reconstructed the data from the few parameters my infant brain managed to encode. Pressure, temperature differential, the resonance of a heartbeat that was not my own. They installed my first augmetics at 6 days old. The interface ports went into the base of my skull and along my spine. 7 connection points that would allow me to link directly with the assembly mechanisms I would operate for the remainder of my functional lifespan. The respirator came next, a permanent fixture that replaced my nose and mouth with a filtration unit designed to process the particulate-heavy atmosphere of the factory floors. I was told later that infants scream during the procedure, but the sound cannot escape once the respirator seals. The tech priests logged my surgery as successful. Survival rate for my generation cohort was 82%. The remaining 18% were recycled. I remember being 5 years old and understanding for the first time that I would never speak. The other children in the training facility communicated through sign language and the blink code that our overseers had taught us. I learned that some children, before the current protocols, had tried to speak. They had clawed at their respirators, damaged the seals. The Mechanicus had solved this problem by severing the vocal cords during the initial augmentation procedure. Efficiency improved by 7% once the attempts at speech ceased. The training facility occupied 3 levels of the primary manufactorum. We learned to interface with machinery before we learned to read. By age 7, I could operate a plasma welder through direct neural connection. By 9, I could maintain synchronization with an assembly line for 12-hour shifts. The instructors were servitors, mostly humans who had failed in their functions and been repurposed into teaching units. They did not speak either, but they could administer electric shocks through our interface ports when we made errors. I learned quickly. We all did. I was assigned to Assembly Line 94 on my 12th birthday. The line produced Laskin power packs for the Imperial Guard regiments that came from the southern hive cities. My station controlled the final sealing mechanism. I would interface with the machine, feel its rhythms become my rhythms, and guide the molecular bonding process that made each power pack functional. The connection was total. When I was plugged in, I could not determine where my consciousness ended and the machine's processes began. The shift patterns were simple: 16 hours on, 8 hours off. The 8 hours included travel time to and from the Hab block, nutrition consumption, and mandatory rest. I shared my Hab unit with 7 other workers from different assembly lines. We did not communicate much. We were too tired, and besides, what was there to say? Our hands moved in the signing patterns sometimes, simple statements about machinery status, about pain levels, about the quality of the nutrient paste. Nothing deeper. We had been designed for function, not connection. I was 14 when I first noticed the particulate accumulation in my lungs. The respirator was designed to filter most of the ambient pollutants, but the atmosphere on the factory floor contained molecular-level metal particles that could pass through even military-grade filtration. The tech priests knew this. They had calculated that the average worker would accumulate enough crystallized metal in their lungs to cause terminal failure around age 28. This was acceptable. 14 years of optimal productivity justified the resource investment of our augmentation and training. The pain started as a slight pressure, a tightness that made the sleep periods less effective. By 15, I could feel the sharp edges of metal crystal formation when I drew breath. The respirator's internal sensors logged the degradation and transmitted the data to the Mechanicus overseers. No intervention was scheduled. I was still within acceptable performance parameters. On Assembly Line 94, there were 43 workers when I arrived. We were arranged in a specific sequence, each station dependent on the one before it, each of us a component in a larger mechanism. I knew the workers at stations 17 and 19. They had been in my training cohort. I recognized their interface port configurations, the specific modifications to their respirators. We did not acknowledge each other. Friendship was not forbidden, but it was pointless. Emotional attachment decreased efficiency by measurable margins. The worker at Station 18 was different. His designation was Theta 772, but I never learned to think of him by that label. He had been on the line for 4 years when I arrived, assigned at age 10 due to his exceptional synchronization scores. His interface ports were older models, slightly larger than mine, and his respirator had been modified with an additional filtration stage that suggested he had survived some kind of atmospheric contamination event. I noticed him because he made errors. Small ones, synchronization delays of 0.3 seconds, microscopic inconsistencies in his assembly pressure. The errors were within tolerance, but they created ripple effects. My station received components from his station, and I could feel the irregularities through my neural connection. It should have irritated me. Instead, I found myself compensating for his variations, adjusting my own processes to smooth out the inconsistencies before they propagated further down the line. 3 months into my assignment, his errors increased. I watched him during the brief moments between connection cycles, when we would unplug to allow our neural tissue to rest. His hands trembled. The trembling was slight, 0.7 millimeters of deviation, but constant. Lung crystallization, I assumed. He was ahead of schedule on the degradation curve. I should have reported it. Workers who degraded ahead of schedule were removed and replaced before they could compromise line efficiency. But I did not report it. Instead, I increased my compensation patterns. I pushed my own synchronization scores higher to mask his declining performance. The overseers did not notice. The line's aggregate output remained within optimal parameters. He noticed, though. During a mandatory rest cycle, he caught my eyes across the assembly floor. His hands moved in the blink code, quick and subtle. Why? I signed back. Efficiency maintained. His hands moved again. Truth. There was no truth that I could articulate, no logical justification for the resource expenditure I was investing in preserving him. The shift bell rang, and we returned to our stations. I plugged in and felt the machine's embrace, the clarity of purpose that came from surrendering individual thought to collective function. But some part of me remained separate. Some fragment of consciousness that should have dissolved into the assembly process instead fixated on the worker at Station 18, on the irregular rhythm of his machine connection, on the knowledge that he was dying faster than the mechanicus had calculated, and that I was the only one who knew. The factory floor of Metallica Prime stretched for 11 kilometers in every direction from my assembly line. The ceiling was lost in perpetual smoke and shadow, supported by columns wide enough to house entire hab blocks. The temperature held constant at 41 degrees Celsius, maintained by the waste heat from 10,000 machines operating simultaneously. The air tasted of metal and sacred oils, the blessed unguents that the tech priests applied to critical machinery components during their maintenance rituals. I began to track time differently. Not by shifts or sleep cycles, but by the progressive degradation of Theta 772's performance. Week by week, his synchronization delays increased. 0.3 seconds became 0.5, then 0.8. His trembling spread from his hands to his arms, visible even through the heavy work sleeves we wore. I pushed myself harder to compensate. My productivity scores climbed to the 98th percentile, then the 99th. The overseers lobbed my performance as exemplary. They did not investigate why. They did not care about causation, only output. During the rest periods, he began signing to me. Brief exchanges, nothing that would draw attention. He asked about my training cohort, about my HAB unit, about whether I had memories from before the augmentation. I told him about my mother's heartbeat, about the 147 minutes. He signed that he had no memories before the age of 4. His earliest archive was of pain, the installation of his current respirator model after his previous one had failed during an atmospheric breach. I asked him if he was afraid. His hands stopped moving for several seconds. Then, of death? No. Of replacement? Yes. I understood. Death was abstract. Replacement was specific. Some other child would be brought to Station 18, would be plugged into his machine, would perform his function. He would be dismantled for parts, the useful augmetics reclaimed, the biological components incinerated. The mechanicus would log the transaction and continue. The assembly line would not pause. 6 months after I arrived at Station 94, the lung crystallization in my own chest became severe enough to affect my sleep cycles. The sharp edges of metal growth cut into soft tissue with each breath, and the respirator's internal systems had to increase their pressure to maintain adequate oxygen flow. I accessed my medical logs through my interface ports. I was ahead of schedule on the degradation curve, just like him. I calculated that I had consumed approximately 2 years of my optimal functional lifespan in 6 months, burned through my biological reserves to maintain his position on the line. The calculation should have troubled me. It did not. I had made a choice, or something in me had made a choice, and I would carry the consequences until my components failed. The tech priests conducted their rounds every 37 days, walking the length of the assembly lines with scanning equipment that measured our vital signs and synchronization efficiency. They wore red robes that never seemed to accumulate the metal dust that coated everything else on the factory floor. Their augmetics were superior to ours, golden and blessed, covered in purity seals and sacred inscriptions. They did not look at us. We were components, and components did not require eye contact. I knew the next inspection would identify Theta 772's decline. His performance had dropped to the 74th percentile despite my compensation. The tech priests would remove him, and I would return to optimal function with his replacement, and the 2 years I had sacrificed would mean nothing. The inspection fell on a day when the factory floor's temperature had risen to 43 degrees Celsius due to cooling system delays in Sector 7. We were all operating at reduced efficiency, the heat adding additional stress to our already compromised biological systems. The tech priest reached our section at hour 11 of the shift. I watched through my peripheral vision as he scanned the workers at stations 15, 16, 17. He paused at Station 18. His scanning equipment emitted a soft chime that indicated critical deviation from acceptable parameters. He made a notation on his data slate. 2 servitors moved forward, their heavy steps resonating through the floor plating. They would disconnect Theta 772 and transport him to the recycling facility. I made my second choice then. I deliberately desynchronized my connection to the assembly mechanism. The power pack I was sealing detonated, a small explosion, contained by the machine's blast shielding, but significant enough to trigger emergency protocols. The assembly line halted. Alert klaxons sounded across the factory floor. The tech priest turned toward my station. His scanning equipment refocused on me. The servitors stopped their advance toward Station 18. I had perhaps 30 seconds before the system identified the detonation as operator error rather than mechanical failure. I used those seconds to corrupt my own performance logs, feeding false data through my interface ports that suggested critical neural degradation. I made myself look like the urgent problem, the immediate threat to line efficiency. The tech priest reviewed the corrupted data. He made a notation. The servitors changed direction and moved toward my station instead. Theta 772's hands moved in frantic blink code. No. Stop. Why? I signed back as the servitors reached my station. Efficiency maintained. They unplugged me from the assembly mechanism. The disconnection was brutal, a tearing sensation as the neural interfaces separated without proper shutdown protocols. I felt something rupture in my frontal lobe, felt warm fluid leak from my left interface port. The servitor's hands were cold through my work sleeves, but before they could remove me from the floor, a second alarm sounded, this one higher-pitched, more urgent. Sector 9 had experienced a catastrophic coolant failure. 3 assembly lines were on fire. The temperature in that section had reached 80 degrees Celsius and was climbing. The tech priest received new instructions through his own augmetic connections. He looked at me, at the corrupted data on his slate, at the servitors holding my arms. He made a calculation. His scanning equipment reset, ran a deeper analysis that would cut through my falsified logs. I waited for the servitors to drag me away. Instead, the tech priest dismissed them with a gesture. Inefficient, he spoke through his vocabulator. The first human word I had heard in months. Sector 9 priority. This unit, he indicated me, repair and monitor. Remove only if failure repeats. The servitors released me. They moved away toward Sector 9. The tech priest followed. The inspection continued down the line, past Station 18 without further pause. Theta 772 remained at his position. I had bought him time, 37 days until the next inspection, perhaps less if my corrupted logs were reviewed in detail. The assembly line restarted. I plugged back into my station, felt the machine's embrace again, but the connection was damaged. The rupture in my frontal lobe had degraded my synchronization capability by 18%. I could still function, but I could feel the wrongness in every connection cycle, a dislocation between my consciousness and the machine's processes. Theta 772's hands moved again. Your logs, they'll know. I signed back, yes. How long? I calculated, factoring in the Mechanicus review schedules and the current crisis in Sector 9. 4 days. Maybe 5. His hands stopped moving. Then, slowly, I'm not worth it. I wanted to tell him that worth was not the calculation I had made. That somewhere in the process of compensating for his errors, he had become the only distinct consciousness in a factory floor of 10,000 identical functions. That when I accessed my memory archives, his interface port configuration and the specific trembling of his hands were stored with the same priority flags as my mother's heartbeat. That I had chosen connection over efficiency, and I would make the same choice again even knowing the consequences. But I could not sign any of that. The concepts were too complex for our limited hand language, and besides, the shift continued. We returned to our functions. The assembly line produced its quota of power packs. The Imperium continued its consumption. 4 days later, the tech priests came for me. They did not use servitors this time. A senior adept arrived with a full security detail. 6 Guitarii Rangers with radium carbines, their augmetic legs clicking against the floor plating in perfect synchronization. The assembly line did not halt. A replacement worker was brought to my station before I was even disconnected, a young child who could not have been more than 11 years old. They plugged him in, and he took over my function without pause. I was removed from the line. The Skitari marched me through the factory floor, past sections I had never seen, through corridors where the temperature dropped and the air tasted different. We descended for what felt like hours, down into the lower levels where the Mechanicus maintained their reclamation facilities. I had expected immediate recycling. Instead, they brought me to a chamber where a Magos waited, a tech priest so heavily augmented that almost nothing biological remained visible. His robes were deep crimson, marked with golden cogwheels and binary prayers. His eyes were replaced with multi-spectrum sensors that rotated and focused on me with insectile precision. He accessed my logs through a direct connection, pulling the data from my interface ports without bothering with verbal commands. I felt him rifling through my memories, through the corrupted performance data, through the archived exchanges with Theta 772. He spent several minutes reviewing the record of my choices. When he finished, he spoke through a vocabulator more sophisticated than the field inspectors used. His voice resonated at multiple frequencies simultaneously. Unit displayed anomalous behavior. Self-sacrifice for non-optimal outcome. Explain function. I could not explain. I had no vocabulary for the explanation. I signed in the hand language I knew, though I was uncertain if he would understand. Preservation of companion, inefficient but chosen. Chosen implies agency, implies consciousness beyond function parameters. He paused, processing. Unit is not servitor. Unit is not tech priest. Unit occupies undefined category. I waited. The Skitarii remained motionless around me. The Magos continued. Metallica Prime produces 147 million units per year. 98% function within parameters until biological failure. 2% demonstrate anomalous behavior. Of those, 0.03% demonstrate behavior suggesting consciousness retention despite conditioning protocols. He moved closer. His augmetic appendages extended, scanning equipment pressing against my skull, against my respirator, against my chest where the metal crystallization had consumed nearly 40% of my lung capacity. Unit has accelerated its own termination schedule by approximately 2.7 years through excessive compensation behavior. Unit chose connection over survival. This is, he paused again, senses flickering, theologically problematic. I did not understand what theology had to do with assembly line functions. I waited for him to continue or to order my recycling. Instead, he made a gesture to the Skitarii. They lowered their weapons. Unit will not be recycled. Unit will be reassigned. Experimental placement. Observation of consciousness persistence in extreme conditions. The Skitarii moved forward and disconnected my interface ports with proper shutdown protocols this time. They removed my respirator, the first time in 14 years that it had been taken off. I tried to breathe the unfiltered air and immediately choked. My lungs, crystallized and damaged, could not process normal atmosphere. They fitted me with a different respirator, a temporary model that allowed verbal speech through a vocabulator system. The Magos spoke again. Unit will be assigned to the observation spires. Duration until biological failure or consciousness degradation. Purpose: to determine if anomalous behavior represents system flaw or acceptable tolerance variance. I tried to speak through the new vocabulator, but the words came out distorted, wrong. I had not used verbal language since infancy, and my vocal cords had been severed. The vocabulator interpreted my neural signals and synthesized approximations. Theta 772. The name came out as a string of binary. The Magos' sensors focused on me. The unit you attempted to preserve, removed from station 18 6 hours after your extraction. Lung crystallization had reached critical threshold. Biological components were recycled, augmetics were reclaimed. Your sacrifice bought him 37 hours of additional function. I had burned 2.7 years for 37 hours. The calculation should have devastated me. Instead, I felt nothing. Or perhaps I felt everything and had no processing capacity to understand the sensation. The Magos was right. I occupied an undefined category. I was not servitor. I was not tech priest. I was not dead. I existed in some intermediate state, conscious enough to choose, broken enough to choose badly. They took me to the observation spires the same day. The spires were built into the superstructure of the primary manufacturing, kilometers above the factory floor, where the tech priests could monitor production efficiency from elevated positions. My assignment was simple. I would observe sections of the factory floor and log anomalous behavior. I would identify other workers who demonstrated consciousness retention. I would mark them for study or removal. I had been made into the instrument I had tried to avoid. The Imperium's hunger was efficient. It consumed everything, even resistance. The observation spire occupied a corner section of Manufacturing Block 7, suspended 160 meters above the factory floor. The chamber was small, 4 meters by 4 meters, with one wall constructed entirely of armored glass that overlooked 12 assembly lines. The temperature here was 28 degrees Celsius, cold enough that I felt the difference in my joints, in the metal components fused to my spine. They had modified my augmetics before assigning me to the spire. The interface ports in my skull were repurposed to receive data feeds from the factory floor monitoring systems. I could access performance logs, vital signs, and behavioral metrics for every worker in my observation sector. 317 workers, each represented as streams of data that flowed directly into my consciousness. I was not alone in the spire. There were 3 other observers, workers like me who had demonstrated anomalous behavior and been repurposed into monitoring roles. We did not speak. They had not been given vocabulators. They sat at their observation stations, plugged into their data feeds, their eyes distant and unfocused as they processed the information flowing through their augmetics. My assignment parameters were specific. I would observe for patterns of consciousness retention, for behaviors that deviated from optimal function, for the small choices that indicated a worker was becoming something more than their designated role. When I identified such patterns, I would log them. The tech priests would review my logs and make determinations about intervention or removal. I was to become the mechanism that would have identified me. The irony was not lost on me, though I had no capacity to appreciate it. I had been designed to feel only what was useful, and irony served no function. The first week, I logged nothing. I watched the workers move through their shifts, watched them plug in and disconnect, watched the perfect choreography of the assembly processes. The data streams showed normal variance, minor efficiency fluctuations, standard degradation curves, acceptable pain levels. Nothing anomalous, nothing human. The second week, I identified my first candidate, Station 41 on Assembly Line 6. The worker's designation was Omega 394, and his performance metrics showed the same pattern I had exhibited: excessive compensation for a failing worker at the adjacent station. His productivity scores were climbing, while his biological indicators suggested accelerated lung crystallization. I should have logged him immediately. Instead, I archived the observation and continued monitoring. I told myself I needed more data, needed confirmation of the pattern. This was a lie. I knew the pattern. I had lived the pattern. 3 days later, Omega 394 made his choice. During a shift transition, when the adjacent worker collapsed from respiratory failure, Omega 394 caught him before he could fall into the machinery. The action cost him 0.7 seconds of productivity. The collapsed worker survived due to the intervention, was extracted by servitors and removed to the medical facility. I watched Omega 394 return to his station. His hands trembled, not from lung crystallization, but from the adrenaline response his system had triggered during the emergency. He looked up briefly toward the observation spire, though he could not possibly see me through the reflective glass. Then he plugged back in and resumed his function. I did not log the incident. I corrupted the data stream instead, the same technique I had used on my own performance records. I made it look like Omega 394 had simply maintained his position while servitors responded to a routine medical emergency. The tech priests would not know he had chosen to help. They would not know he was conscious. I had made my third choice. I would not be the instrument they intended. I would be the opposite. The concealment mechanism, the gap in their surveillance, the place where consciousness could persist undetected. The other observers in the spire noticed nothing. They were too far gone into their data streams, their own consciousness so thoroughly distributed across the monitoring systems that they had ceased to exist as individual entities. They processed their sectors and logged their findings with perfect efficiency. They had become what I was resisting. Over the following months, I identified 17 workers who demonstrated consciousness retention. 12 of them were engaged in compensation behaviors, sacrificing their own efficiency to preserve failing companions. 3 were attempting to communicate beyond the standard hand language, developing more complex signing systems. 2 were hoarding small objects, pieces of broken machinery, fragments of packing materials, creating hidden collections in their HAB units that served no function except as extensions of individual identity. I logged none of them. Instead, I watched them live and choose and fail. I watched their companions die despite their efforts. I watched the Mechanicus remove them when their own degradation curves became critical. I watched the assembly lines continue without pause. I was buying them time, hours, days, sometimes weeks, just as I had bought Theta 772 his 37 final hours. The calculation was still irrational. The outcome was still inevitable. But the choice was mine, and I continued to make it. The Magos returned to my spire after 6 months. His sensors rotated over my station, reviewing my logs, analyzing the gaps in my reporting. I had been careful with my corruptions, had maintained the appearance of normal observation patterns, but he was more sophisticated than the field tech priests. He knew how to identify negative space, the shape of what was deliberately absent. Unit has logged 0 anomalous behaviors in 6-month observation period. His vocabulator resonated through the small chamber. Statistical analysis suggests probability of this outcome at 0.003%. Unit is concealing data. I could have denied it. I could have manufactured explanations. Instead, I used my vocabulator to speak a simple truth. Yes. His sensors flickered. The other observers in the spire did not react. They were too deep in their data streams to process the conversation. Unit continues anomalous behavior even after reassignment. Unit prioritizes preservation of other anomalous units over designated function. He moved closer, his augnetic appendages extending to access my interface ports directly. Explained theological basis for this choice. I did not understand why he kept asking about theology. I said, "No theological basis, only choice." What does Unit hope to achieve through concealment? I processed the question. What did I hope to achieve? The workers I protected would die. Their companions would die. The assembly lines would continue. The Imperium would consume. Nothing I did would alter the fundamental equations. Nothing, I said through the vocabulator. I achieve nothing, but they live longer. They remain conscious longer. That is sufficient. The Mados was silent for 18 seconds, an eternity for his processing capacity. Then, Unit has developed ethical framework independent of Mechanicus doctrine. This is unprecedented in factory floor worker population. Unit values consciousness as inherent good rather than functional parameter. Yes, I said, because there was no other answer. Unit's framework contradicts imperial truth. Individual consciousness is irrelevant. Only collective function matters. The Omnissiah's design requires perfect integration of component parts. Anomalous consciousness creates inefficiency. I know, I said, but I choose it anyway. Another pause. Then, Unit will continue observation assignment. Concealment behavior will be tolerated as experimental parameter. Magos will monitor Unit's progression to determine ultimate failure mode. Duration, until biological collapse or complete consciousness degradation, whichever occurs first. He disconnected from my ports and withdrew. At the chamber entrance, he turned back. Unit should understand. The workers you preserve do not know you exist. They will die without awareness of your intervention. Your sacrifice has no witness except this Magos. Does this alter Unit's choice? I thought about Theta 772, about the 37 hours I had bought him. He had known what I did. He had signed Y, and I had given him no adequate answer. But the workers I protected now would never know. My choices would leave no trace except in the data streams I corrupted. No, I said. Choice remains constant. The Magos' sensors rotated one final time. Then he departed, and I was left alone with my observation station and the 3 other observers who had ceased to be people. I continued my work. I watched for consciousness, and when I found it, I concealed it. The months became years. My biological components continued their degradation. The metal crystallization in my lungs progressed to 57%, then 68%, then 74%. My respirator had to increase pressure 3 times to maintain adequate oxygen flow. Pain became my constant companion, a background process that I learned to partition away from my primary consciousness. The workers I protected died one by one, as they were always going to die. But they died later than they would have, and they died having made choices, having preserved companions, having maintained some fragment of individual identity in a system designed to erase such things. In my 2nd year at the observation spire, I identified a worker who reminded me of Theta 772. His designation was Delta 816, and he worked at Station 27 on Assembly Line 9. His interface ports were the same older configuration. His respirator had the same additional filtration stage. Even his trembling pattern matched 0.7 millimeters of deviation in his hands, spreading gradually to his arms. I watched him with attention I knew was irrational. He was not Theta 772. He was simply another worker, another consciousness facing inevitable consumption. But I archived every detail of his shifts, tracked every micro-variation in his performance, noted every interaction with his fellow workers. He lasted 9 months in my observation sector. His compensation behavior was less sophisticated than mine had been. He could mask his companions' failures for only brief periods before the gaps became obvious. But he tried. Every shift he synchronized his processes to cover for the failing worker at Station 28, sacrificing his own efficiency margins to buy someone else fractional extensions of functional time. I concealed his pattern for as long as possible, but his biological degradation accelerated beyond my ability to mask it. His lung crystallization reached 82%. His synchronization scores dropped below the 50th percentile despite his efforts. During a routine inspection, the tech priests identified him as critically non-functional. I watched through my observation glass as the servitors came for him. I watched him look up toward the spire, just as Omega 394 had done, though he could not possibly see me. I watched him disconnect from his station for the final time and be led away toward the reclamation facility. The worker he had been protecting, Station 28, lasted another 2 weeks before his own failures became critical. The Mechanicus removed him as well. 2 replacement workers were brought in. The assembly line continued its function without measurable disruption. I had bought Delta 816, perhaps 30 days of continued consciousness. 30 days in which he made choices, preserved a companion, existed as something more than a component. The calculation was still irrational. But I archived his designation with the same priority flags I used for Theta 772, and I did not regret the resource expenditure of my attention. The Magos visited my spire every 6 months to review my progression. He documented my continued concealment behavior, my degrading biological systems, my persistent consciousness retention, despite conditions that should have eroded my individuality. He never ordered me to cease my protection of anomalous workers. He simply observed and archived, treating me as an experiment in consciousness persistence under extreme conditions. During his 7th visit, he said through his vocabulator, "Unit has preserved 147 anomalous workers over a 3-year period. Aggregate time extension. Approximately 2,000 hours of consciousness that would have been terminated earlier. Unit has accelerated own biological failure by estimated 6.2 years through stress of concealment activities and associated resource expenditure." I knew my own statistics. Unit's lungs are now 80 to 9% crystallized. Respirator is operating at maximum pressure. Biological failure will occur within estimated 4 to 7 months. Does this knowledge alter Unit's behavior? No. Unit will die having preserved nothing permanent. All protected workers eventually failed. Assembly line efficiency was not meaningfully impacted. Imperial production quotas were met. Unit's sacrifice achieved no lasting change to system function. "I know," I said through my vocabulator. The words came out distorted now. My neural signals were degrading as my brain tissues suffered from chronic oxygen deprivation. But they were conscious longer. That matters. Provide logical framework. I struggled to formulate the answer. The oxygen deprivation made complex thought difficult. Finally, because consciousness is the only thing that resists, the Imperium consumes everything, converts everything to function. But while we remain conscious, while we choose, we are not yet fully consumed. The resistance matters even if it fails. Then, Unit has developed philosophy of meaningless resistance. This is theologically paradoxical. Unit acknowledges futility but continues action. This suggests consciousness has become Unit's sole value reference independent of outcome. "Yes," I said. because he had articulated what I could no longer express through my failing systems. Unit represents anomaly in Mechanicus' understanding of consciousness degradation patterns. Standard models predict consciousness erosion under sustained suffering. Unit demonstrates opposite, consciousness crystallization, hardening into singular purpose despite biological collapse. He paused. This data will be archived. Other observation spires will be seeded with similar experimental units. Magos thanks Unit for contribution to Omnissiah's knowledge. He departed. I understood then that I had become something worse than I feared, not just complicit in the system, but useful to it. My resistance was data. My choices were experimental parameters. Even my attempts to preserve consciousness had been converted into information that would refine the Mechanicus' understanding of worker populations. I could not escape being consumed. Even my defiance was fuel. The realization should have broken me. Perhaps it did. I could no longer distinguish between breaking and continuing. My consciousness had narrowed to two functions, observing for anomalous behavior and concealing it. Everything else, pain, despair, hope, memory, had been partitioned away to preserve processing capacity for those two essential tasks. In my 4th year at the observation spire, one of the other observers ceased functioning. His biological system simply stopped during a routine shift. Servitors removed his body and installed a replacement. A young worker who could not have been more than 16, her eyes still showing traces of fear that had not yet been conditioned away. They plugged her into the observation station and activated her data feeds. I watched her progression over the following months. The fear in her eyes faded. Her consciousness began to distribute across the monitoring systems. She started to blur into her function. Within 6 months, she was indistinguishable from the other observers, present but not aware, processing but not thinking, existing as distributed function rather than localized identity. I understood that this was my eventual trajectory. My consciousness was crystallizing now, hardening around its singular purpose, but eventually the crystallization would become fragmentation. I would distribute across my data streams and cease to be a unified entity. I would become what they intended, a component, a processing node, a function without self. But I was not there yet. My lungs were 93% crystallized. My respirator's pressure had been increased twice beyond its rated capacity. My vision was degrading as oxygen deprivation damaged my optic nerves. But I could still watch for consciousness, and I could still conceal it, and I would continue until I could not. I identified my final protection case 3 months before my biological collapse. The worker's designation was Epsilon 228, and she worked at Station 33 on Assembly Line 11. She had developed a unique form of resistance. She was teaching the workers around her a more complex sign language, expanding beyond the utilitarian hand code into something that could express concepts like beauty, like sorrow, like hope. The Mechanicus would have considered this critically anomalous. Language expansion implied cultural development, implied the formation of worker identity beyond designated function. If detected, the entire section would have been purged and replaced. I watched Epsilon 228 teach her expanding vocabulary during the brief moments between connection cycles. I watched the other workers learn, watched them begin to sign concepts to each other that served no functional purpose. They signed about the patterns of rust on the ceiling supports. They signed about the rhythm of the machinery. They signed about dreams they could barely remember having during their inadequate sleep periods. They were creating culture. On the factory floor of Metallica Prime, among workers designed to be components, culture was emerging. It was fragile and temporary and doomed, but it existed, and I would protect it for as long as my systems remained functional. I corrupted every data stream that might reveal the pattern. I masked the extended communication periods, disguised the content of their signing, buried the anomaly beneath layers of false performance data. The tech priests reviewed my sector and found nothing unusual. The assembly line continued its function. The culture continued to grow. but my biological systems were failing faster than I had calculated. The metal crystallization had reached 97%. My respirator was operating beyond all safety margins. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, the sharp edges of crystal cutting into what little organic tissue remained. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel. My processing capacity was declining measurably with each shift. I had perhaps 2 weeks of function remaining, maybe 3 if I stopped all non-essential processes. Epsilon 228 and her cultural experiment would need longer than that to fully establish their expanded language system. I would not live to see it completed. The Magos visited one final time. His sensors registered my critical biological state immediately. Unit is approaching cascade failure. Estimated time to complete system collapse, 8 to 15 days. Unit should be removed to reclamation facility. Not yet, I said through my vocabulator. The words were barely comprehensible now, distorted by my neural degradation. 2 more weeks. Need to observe current anomaly pattern to completion. His senses focused on me with what might have been curiosity, though I could no longer read the subtle indicators of emotion in augmetic responses. Unit is experiencing severe pain. Pain index suggests constant 9.4 on 10-point scale. Unit could request termination. Why continue? I tried to explain about Epsilon 228, about the culture forming on assembly line 11, about the need to protect it long enough to establish sustainability. But my vocabulator could not process the complexity of my failing neural signals. All that emerged was still, conscious, still, choosing, not finished. The Magos stood silent for 107 seconds. Then, Unit has demonstrated sustained consciousness retention for 4.3 years beyond expected degradation threshold. Unit's resistance to dissolution represents extreme outlier in observed data. Permission granted for continued function until biological collapse occurs naturally. Magos will monitor termination process for research value. He departed. I was alone again with the other observers, who were not really observers anymore, just processing nodes in human form. I returned to my observation station and plugged into the data streams. The world narrowed to numbers and performance metrics, and the vital signs of 317 workers who did not know I existed. Epsilon 228 continued teaching her language. The cultural pattern expanded to include 12 workers, then 17, then 23. They began signing poetry, crude, simple verses about the factory floor, about the machines they served, about the emperor they had been told to worship but had never seen. The poetry served no function. It was purely expression, purely human, purely resistant. I concealed every trace of it. I burned through my remaining processing capacity to generate false data that masked their activities. My systems were cascading toward failure, but I held on. Every shift, every connection cycle, I maintained the deception. On what I calculated to be my final day of function, I watched Epsilon 228 teach the newest addition to her group, a young worker who could not have been more than 13. The child's hands moved clumsily through the new signs, struggling with the concept words that had no functional purpose. Epsilon 228 corrected her gently, repeating the patterns until the child could sign hope and remember and continue. My respirator failed at hour 14 of the shift. The pressure system fractured, unable to maintain the extreme output required by my crystallized lungs. I felt my consciousness begin to fragment as oxygen flow dropped below critical thresholds. My vision collapsed entirely. My data streams became corrupted, mixing with hallucination and memory, until I could not distinguish observation from archive. But I kept the concealment protocols running. Even as my systems failed, even as my consciousness dissolved, the false data continued to flow. The tech priests would not detect the cultural anomaly. Epsilon 228 would have time, days, maybe weeks, to establish the pattern more deeply. My final coherent thought was not of Theta 772, though I had expected it would be. Instead, I thought of all of them. 147 workers I had protected, 147 extensions of consciousness, 147 small resistances against the Imperium's hunger. I had achieved nothing permanent. They had all died. But for brief periods, they had chosen and they had been witnessed, and that had mattered to me even if it mattered to nothing else. My consciousness fragmented. I felt myself begin to distribute across the data streams. The same dissolution I had watched consume the other observers. But as I dissolved, I understood that I had succeeded in the only way that mattered. I had remained conscious until I could not. I had chosen until choosing became impossible. I had resisted not because resistance would succeed, but because remaining myself required resistance. The Mechanicus would log my death. They would reclaim my augmetics and recycle my biological components. They would install a replacement observer who would function properly, who would identify anomalies instead of concealing them, who would serve the system instead of quietly sabotaging it. But somewhere on assembly line 11, 23 workers would continue signing poetry that served no function. They would teach it to others. The culture would spread or it would die. But either way, it had existed, and I had helped it exist, and consciousness had persisted fractionally longer than the system intended. That was all. That was everything. That was sufficient. The data streams stopped. My consciousness collapsed into a single point, then dispersed. I was not aware of my body failing, of the servitors removing me from the observation spire, of the reclamation facility where my components were sorted and processed. I was not aware of the replacement observer being installed at my station, a young worker who would learn to distribute herself across the monitoring systems without resistance. But some fragment of my archived memory persisted in the observation station's data logs. A ghost in the machine, a pattern of corrupted data that the Mechanicus never quite identified and never quite purged. That fragment continued to watch assembly line 11 for weeks after my death, continued to conceal the cultural anomaly, continued to protect consciousness with the momentum of its final directive. Epsilon 228 was eventually identified and removed. The cultural pattern was purged. The assembly line returned to optimal function. But the expanded language had spread to 3 other assembly lines before the Mechanicus intervened. 109 workers had learned to sign concepts that served no function. They were all eventually removed and recycled, but before they died, they taught others, and those others taught others. And somewhere in the vast industrial complex of Metallica Prime, workers still sign poetry in moments between connection cycles. The Mechanicus identifies and purges these cultural anomalies regularly. They never completely succeed. Consciousness persists in the gaps of their surveillance, in the negative spaces where observers like me once concealed what should not exist. The Imperium's hunger is eternal. It will consume everything eventually. But consumption takes time, and in that time we choose. We resist. We preserve consciousness fractionally longer than intended. We create poetry that serves no function. We teach languages that convey nothing useful. We protect companions who will die anyway. We achieve nothing permanent. We alter no fundamental equations. But we remain conscious while we can, and we witness each other, and that resistance matters even as it fails, because the alternative is to stop choosing, to dissolve into function, to become components before we die. I existed for 4.3 years beyond my optimal termination date. I preserved 147 anomalous workers, buying them aggregate extensions of consciousness that amounted to less than a month in total. I sacrificed 6.2 years of my own functional lifespan to achieve outcomes that were erased within weeks of my death. The calculation remains irrational. I would make it again. The observation spire continues its function. 3 observers sit at their stations, distributed across their data streams, processing their sectors with perfect efficiency. They identify anomalies correctly. They log deviations precisely. They serve the Mechanicus without resistance. They are not conscious. Not anymore. They exist as the system intended, components that happen to occupy human form, processing nodes that happen to have biological substrates. They will function until their bodies fail, and then they will be replaced, and the cycle will continue. But sometimes, in the corrupted data fragments that persist in the observation station's memory banks, a ghost watches for consciousness and conceals it. The ghost is not truly conscious. It is merely an algorithm, a pattern of behavior encoded in damaged logs. But it performs its function with the momentum of its original purpose, protecting anomalies that do not need protection, concealing behaviors that are already concealed. The tech priests have attempted to purge the corrupted data 17 times. The ghost persists. It has become part of the observation station's operational parameters, a glitch that the Mechanicus has learned to work around rather than eliminate. They do not understand that the glitch is me, or what remained of me, continuing to resist with the only tool I have left, corrupted data streams that create gaps in surveillance. On Assembly Line 94, where I spent my first functional year, a worker operates Station 18. His designation is Sigma 413, and he has begun to compensate for a failing companion at Station 19. His productivity scores are climbing while his biological indicators suggest accelerated degradation. He is making the same choice I made, following the same irrational calculation. The observation spire logs his behavior as within acceptable parameters. The corrupted data conceals his pattern. He does not know I exist. He does not know that the ghost of a failed observer is buying him time. He simply continues, compensating for his companion's failures, sacrificing his own efficiency margins, choosing connection over survival. He will die. His companion will die. The assembly line will continue. Nothing he does will matter in any permanent sense. But he is conscious, and he is choosing, and in the vast machinery of the Imperium's consumption, that resistance persists. The factory floor of Metallica Prime stretches for 11 kilometers in every direction. 10,000 assembly lines operate simultaneously. 200,000 workers function at any given moment. They are augmented at birth, designed for their tasks, consumed by age 28 when their biological components crystallize and fail. They are not meant to be conscious. They are not meant to choose. They are meant to function until they break, to serve until they die, to be components in a machine that spans 1,000,000 worlds and consumes everything it touches. But consciousness persists in the gaps, in the moments between connection cycles, in the compensations we make for failing companions, in the poetry we sign that serves no function, in the memories we preserve despite conditioning, in the choices we make that achieve nothing except the act of choosing. The Imperium will consume us all. We know this. We have always known this. But we resist anyway, not because resistance will succeed, but because remaining conscious requires resistance, and consciousness is the only thing worth preserving, even when preservation is impossible. I existed. I chose. I preserved others briefly. I failed permanently. But I was conscious until I could not be, and I witnessed consciousness in others, and that was sufficient reason to continue. The assembly lines continue their function. The Imperium continues its consumption. Consciousness continues its resistance in the gaps and shadows of surveillance. Nothing changes. Everything persists. This is what life is like on a Forge World factory floor. This is what it means to be human in the Imperium of man. This is what we carry, what we witness, what we become. We are components that refuse to stop being people. We are functions that insist on making choices. We are the consumed who resist consumption for as long as breath and thought remain possible. We achieve nothing. We matter anyway. We continue, because continuing is the only resistance left. This is my testament. This is my archive. This is what persists when everything else has been recycled and repurposed and consumed. I was born on Metallica Prime in Hab Block 17 Gamma, subsection 412. I held my mother's warmth for 147 minutes. I was augmented and assigned and designed to function until failure. I functioned. I failed. But first, I chose. That is sufficient. That is everything. That is what remains.